The alley was silent, except for the faint rattle of a tin can rolling in the wind. Shadows stretched long across broken pavement, and beneath the flicker of a dying street lamp, a dog lay curled against the cold wall. His ribs pressed sharply against thin, patchy fur, his eyes clouded but not yet extinguished. Hunger had carved valleys into his body, but it was loneliness that hollowed him most. He didn't lift his head when footsteps approached. He had long since learned that footsteps rarely meant kindness. But this night was different. A man paused at the end of the alley, his breath white in the winter air. He could have kept walking. He almost did. Yet something in the stillness tugged at him, as if the night itself had stopped breathing, waiting for what he would choose. The man's gaze landed on the dog's trembling frame, and his heart clenched in a way he hadn't felt for years. Somewhere between pity and recognition, he realized this wasn't just a stray. This was a soul holding on to its last fragile thread, and the thread was now in his hands. The man stood still at the mouth of the alley. The breath in his chest caught somewhere between fear and recognition. He had walked this street 100 times before, though never at this hour. Never when the city felt like a ghost town stripped of its noise. Tonight the streetlights flickered with uneven rhythm, spilling thin pools of yellow onto cracked pavement, leaving long corridors of shadow between them. And in that stretch of shadow lay the dog. So still he might have been mistaken for discarded rags, so fragile he seemed barely tethered to life. The man's first instinct was to step back. It was easier that way. He knew the rules of this city. You don't look too long at what hurts, because the moment you see it clearly, it becomes your responsibility. But his eyes refused to leave. The dog's body was thin beyond comprehension. His ribs pressed against his skin, as though the bones themselves were trying to escape. Every rise and fall of his chest was shallow, like each breath carried the weight of a decision, whether to keep going or give up entirely. The air smelled faintly of rust and rain, that metallic tang that clings to forgotten places. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, but here the silence was almost suffocating. The man swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind whispered excuses. Someone else will find him. This isn't your problem. You can't save everything. But the excuses sounded hollow against the simple, undeniable truth: this creature was dying. He crouched slowly, his knees creaking with the effort, and studied the dog from a distance of a few feet. A pair of eyes lifted to meet his. Eyes clouded with exhaustion but still carrying a flicker. A shard of light that hadn't yet surrendered. The look pierced straight through him, unraveling a memory he hadn't expected, a boy sitting on a curb years ago, his own stomach empty, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. The man blinked hard, shaking the image away, but the wound it left in his chest pulsed fresh. He whispered, barely audible, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile air between them. Hey, buddy." The sound of his voice stirred the dog just enough to twitch an ear. Not movement enough to rise, not trust enough to approach, but acknowledgement nonetheless. The man felt his chest tighten. Something in that tiny reaction carried more weight than words ever could. It was the faintest proof of life, and therefore, the faintest proof of hope. He slid a hand into his jacket pocket, searching for anything at all, that might coax the dog closer. His fingers closed around a crumpled granola bar wrapper. He hesitated, unwrapped it slowly, and held out a piece of the bar. The smell of oats and honey drifted faintly into the cold night air. For a long while, nothing happened. The dog stared, eyes flickering between suspicion and hunger. His body trembled, not from the cold alone, but from the effort of holding himself back. Then, with a trembling motion, he shifted, inch by inch, toward the outstretched hand. His movements were jagged, weak, as though every step was borrowed strength. When he finally reached the man's fingertips, he didn't snatch the food. Instead, he lowered his head, sniffed once, and licked tentatively before taking the smallest bite. The man exhaled, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. He felt something uncoil inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, relief that mattered, relief born of connection. The dog chewed slowly, cautiously, eyes never leaving the man's face. Trust was not given here, it was bartered, piece by fragile piece. "Good boy," the man murmured, his voice cracking despite himself. "You're still fighting, huh?" The words weren't really for the dog. They were for himself, a reflection slipping uninvited from his chest. The dog's resilience stirred a painful recognition. How many nights had he himself fought to stay afloat, when the world felt indifferent to his survival? He couldn't count them anymore. As the dog finished the bite, his body sagged spent. The man hesitated, then removed his jacket, spreading it gently over the thin frame. The fabric swallowed the dog almost entirely, but he didn't resist. He only shivered once, then sank into the warmth with a faint sigh. For a moment, the man remained crouched there, jacketless against the cold night, watching the dog's body rise and fall beneath the fabric. He should leave now, he told himself. It was late, and tomorrow held responsibilities that would not wait. But his legs refused to straighten. Instead, he sat down against the opposite wall, the concrete biting cold against his back. Time moved strangely there. Minutes slipped into hours, the city sounds fading until all that remained was the fragile rhythm of the dog's breathing. The man closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall, and wondered why this mattered so much. He wasn't a rescuer. He wasn't a saint. He was just a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and built walls so high that nothing was supposed to get through. Yet here, in a forgotten alley with a starving dog pressed beneath his jacket, those walls began to crack. The night grew colder. He rubbed his hands together, blew warm breath into his palms, and tucked the edges of the jacket closer around the dog's frail body. Each gesture was small, almost instinctive, but together they carried the weight of a promise he hadn't spoken aloud. "You're not alone anymore." When dawn finally broke, the sky painted itself in pale blue and gold. The first slivers of light reached into the alley, brushing against brick walls and broken glass, until they landed on the dog's face. His eyes flickered open, catching the light just enough to shine. And for the first time, the man saw not only hunger, not only fear, but a glimmer of trust, tentative yet undeniable. The man rose stiffly, stretching his numb legs. He looked down at the dog, who struggled to lift his head but didn't look away. Something passed between them in that quiet exchange, something wordless but binding. The man spoke softly, as if afraid of breaking the spell. "All right, buddy. Let's get you out of here." And with those words, the silence of the alley broke, not with noise, but with possibility. The man carried the dog in his arms, cradling him the way one might carry a fragile secret. His body was lighter than expected, shockingly so, as if bones alone were holding his shape together. Each step toward home felt heavier, not because of the dog's weight, but because of the enormity of what he had just done. Rescue wasn't a single act, it was a chain reaction, a vow spoken in silence, and now it was his to uphold. The streets were still half asleep in the grey hush of dawn. Shop shutters clanged as early workers pulled them open, and the bitter smell of yesterday's garbage mixed with the first whiffs of baking bread from a corner bakery. The man walked quickly, keeping his eyes forward, ignoring the stares of strangers who glanced at the bundle in his arms. To them it might have looked odd, a stray wrapped in a jacket, its head lolling with exhaustion. To him, it was all that mattered. When he reached his apartment, he hesitated at the door. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and stale paint, the kind of place where neighbors rarely spoke and lives remained compartmentalized. He balanced the dog in one arm while fumbling for his keys, his heart thudding harder than it should. Bringing the dog here felt irreversible, like crossing a threshold into a chapter he wasn't sure he could write. Inside, the apartment was quiet, stripped of warmth. The blinds were half closed, leaving streaks of light that revealed the stillness of empty furniture, the silence of rooms too accustomed to solitude. He laid the dog gently on an old blanket spread across the floor, then crouched beside him. The jacket slipped away, revealing the frailty beneath. Patches of missing fur, sores where skin had been rubbed raw, the sunken hollows where strength should have been. The man exhaled slowly. This was not going to be simple. He went to the kitchen and filled a bowl with water. When he placed it near the dog, the animal's nose twitched, but he didn't move right away. Minutes passed before he leaned forward, trembling, to take a cautious sip. The sound of water lapping was small, but it struck the man's chest like thunder. He hadn't realized how tense he was until relief coursed through him. Food was harder. The man shredded small pieces of bread, softer than the granola from the alley, and placed them on a saucer. The dog sniffed, then ate them slowly, pausing after every bite as if unsure whether his body could handle it. The man watched carefully, resisting the urge to rush. Too much food could harm him now. Everything had to be measured, deliberate, like rebuilding a broken bridge one plank at a time. Later, he filled the bathtub with lukewarm water. The sound of the faucet made the dog flinch, his ears folding back in alarm. The man's throat tightened. "It's okay," he whispered, kneeling beside him. "I've got you." Lifting him again, he lowered the frail body into the water. The dog shivered, not from cold, but from fear. His claws clicked against porcelain as though he might scramble free, but the man kept one hand steady on his back. With the other, he cupped water and poured it gently over the filthy fur. Brown rivulets ran down the drain, carrying away weeks, maybe months, of neglect. Every touch was tender, careful, an unspoken apology for all the hands that had never reached out before. By the time he wrapped the dog in a towel, both of them were exhausted. The man sat cross-legged on the bathroom floor, pressing the shivering body against his chest to share warmth. He rested his chin lightly on the dog's head, inhaling the damp, earthy smell of fur mingled with soap. He hadn't held another living being like this in years. As the day unfolded, the man realized rescue wasn't only about tending to wounds. It was about patience, about carrying the weight of mistrust without demanding it to lift too soon. Every sound in the apartment startled the dog. Every movement of the man's hand made him flinch before leaning back in, unsure whether to fear or to hope. That night, the man lay on the floor beside the blanket instead of his bed. The dog had curled into the smallest ball, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking open at every creak. The man whispered stories into the dim light. Half-remembered tales from his childhood, confessions he had never spoken aloud. Fragments of a life that had been both lonely and long. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe because speaking them out loud made them real. Maybe because the dog's listening silence felt like the first safe space he'd ever had. He thought about his father, the silence between them heavier than words. He thought about the years he had spent drifting, building walls so high no one could climb them. And as he spoke, his hand reached tentatively toward the dog's back. The first touch made him flinch, muscles tensing. But slowly, cautiously, the dog didn't pull away. His breathing steadied, his body sinking deeper into the blanket. And for the first time, sleep came without fight. The man stared at the ceiling in the darkness, the weight of it all pressing down. He had thought rescuing meant saving the dog. But as his own chest softened, as loneliness leaked out in whispered breaths, he realized something he hadn't dared admit. Maybe the dog was rescuing him too. When morning came, light filtered through the blinds in thin gold stripes, painting warmth across the room. The man rolled onto his side, bleary-eyed, and saw the dog still there, still breathing, still alive. A fragile victory, yet one that anchored him more than anything had in years. He whispered with a half-smile, voice hoarse with sleep. "Good morning, buddy. We made it through the night." The dog lifted his head, ears twitching. And for the first time, his tail gave the faintest, trembling wag. The days that followed carried the rhythm of quiet beginnings, the kind of days that blur together but leave behind something permanent. The dog was still weak, his body thin as parchment, yet each morning brought a flicker of change, small, almost invisible, but enough to keep hope alive. At first, trust was measured in inches. When the man entered the room, the dog's ears would flick back, body coiled as if ready to vanish. But then, slowly, he began to linger instead of retreat. His eyes, once clouded with suspicion, started to hold their gaze a fraction longer. It wasn't surrender, not yet, but a cautious willingness to see what came next. The man learned patience in those inches. He moved slower than he ever had, lowering himself to the floor rather than towering above, speaking in tones softer than whispers. He discovered that silence mattered as much as words. That sometimes, the dog listened more to the absence of noise than to any reassurance spoken aloud. Feeding became ritual. The man prepared small bowls of chicken broth, rice, and soft bread, setting them down gently before stepping back. At first, The dog wouldn't eat until the man retreated across the room, turning his body sideways so as not to loom. But after a week, something changed. The dog approached the bowl while the man was still near, pausing every few bites to glance up at him, measuring his presence not as threat, but as part of safety. That glance, brief, uncertain, felt like a miracle each time. One evening after the sun had dipped and the apartment glowed in the soft amber of a single lamp, the dog made his boldest move yet. The man was sitting cross-legged on the floor, absently tracing a scar on his hand, lost in thought. Without warning, the dog shuffled forward and rested a paw, trembling, against his knee. The touch was light, hesitant but intentional. The man froze, breath caught in his throat. He dared not move, afraid the moment would scatter like dust. But then his eyes stung with tears he hadn't expected. Tears he didn't fight this time. "Hey there," he whispered, voice breaking. "It's okay. I'm here." The paw stayed, and that was enough. There were setbacks too. Nights when the dog woke in panic, scrambling in the dark, eyes wide as though expecting the world to hurt him again. The man would sit awake, whispering gently until the trembling eased, sometimes wrapping the thin body in his arms despite the scratches that came with fear. These nights carved deep lines of exhaustion into him, but also deepened the bond, because every moment of fear endured together became another thread of trust woven tight. Outside the apartment, the city lived on in noise and chaos, but within those four walls, time felt slower, quieter, almost sacred. The man had stopped turning on the television. He didn't need it anymore. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the subtle music of paws against floorboards, the soft sound of water being lapped from a bowl, the sigh of breath when the dog finally slept without flinching. Weeks passed, and strength returned little by little. Fur began to regrow in the barren patches, ribs softened beneath new layers of flesh, and the dog's eyes cleared, brightening in ways the man had never seen before. The first time the dog attempted a playful bow, front legs stretched forward, tail wagging low and uncertain. The man laughed out loud, a sound that startled even himself. It had been so long since laughter had lived in that apartment. It echoed against the walls like sunlight breaking into a dark room. One afternoon, he decided to try something new. He clipped a makeshift leash to a collar he had bought at the corner store, his hands trembling slightly as he fastened it. "Just the hallway," he murmured, as though promising both of them it wouldn't be too much. The dog's body tensed at the tug, ears flat against his head, but after a pause he took a step forward. Then another. The leash slackened. They walked the narrow hallway like explorers charting an unclaimed world. Neighbors peeked through doors, curious but silent, watching the man and the fragile creature moving side by side. To the man, it wasn't a hallway at all. It was a bridge, a passage into a life where movement wasn't survival, but possibility. By the time they returned to the apartment, both were breathless. Not from exertion, but from the strange exhilaration of it. The man knelt to unclip the leash, and the dog pressed closer, his body leaning into the touch instead of pulling away. That leaning, that surrender of weight, was heavier with meaning than any word could ever hold. That night, as the man lay on the floor again beside the blanket, the dog inched forward until his head rested lightly against the man's arm. The contact was brief, fragile, but it rooted the man so deeply he could barely breathe. He stared into the darkness, tears slipping quietly down his cheeks, and thought about how strange it was that the smallest gestures could carry the greatest weight. That trust could grow from silence and patience rather than grand declarations. And for the first time in years, the man allowed himself to imagine tomorrow not as an empty burden, but as something he might actually want to reach. The dog shifted closer in sleep, the breath warm against his skin. The man whispered into the dark, voice trembling but certain, "We're getting there, buddy. One step at a time." The morning began like any other. Sunlight leaking in pale gold through the blinds, the smell of coffee curling into the room, the quiet shuffle of paws against hardwood. The man had grown used to these rhythms, small rituals that once seemed impossible, but now stitched his days together. The dog's eyes, brighter now, followed him as he moved around the kitchen. There was comfort in that gaze, in knowing he was no longer invisible. It was a Saturday, and the city outside was alive. The man clipped the leash to the collar, as he always did, and the two stepped into the crisp air. The world beyond the apartment still overwhelmed the dog at times. The honk of cars, the rush of bicycles, the voices that bounced between tall buildings. But with every walk, he grew steadier, paws finding confidence on the pavement. They turned down a quieter street lined with shuttered shops. The man breathed easier here, the noise fading into background hum. But peace, fragile as it was, has a way of shattering in an instant. It happened fast. Two men burst from a doorway ahead, voices raised in anger, their movements sharp and unpredictable. One stumbled into the street, colliding with the man's shoulder. A shout, a flash of aggression, the glint of something metallic in his hand. The man's chest seized. Memories of dark nights, fights he had once fled, wounds he still carried like ghosts. He froze, body rigid with the old terror he thought he had left behind. The world narrowed. His breath came shallow, his palms clammy. The urge to retreat pulled at him, to step back, to disappear, just as he had so many times before. But before he could move, a sound split the moment. A growl, low, steady, alive with fire. The dog, once starved and trembling in a forgotten alley, now stood firm at his side. His body was angled forward, ribs no longer sharp but strong, fur bristling along his spine. His teeth bared, not in panic but in protection, his stance unwavering as if to say, "You will not touch him." The man blinked, disbelief flooding him. He had expected fear, retreat, but instead he saw defiance. The dog's eyes blazed with something raw and unshakable, a loyalty born not from instinct alone, but from the bond they had built in quiet nights and whispered promises. The aggressor took a step closer, but the growl deepened, vibrating through the leash, through the man's bones. It was a sound that demanded respect, that reminded anyone within earshot this creature, once broken, now carried a fire worth fearing. The man felt it too, the shield of it, the strength that wasn't his alone anymore. "Easy," the man murmured, his voice low, steadying both of them. But inside, his chest surged with something fierce and unfamiliar pride. The men hesitated, muttered curses, then backed away, retreating into the blur of city noise. The danger passed as quickly as it had come, but the moment lingered, suspended in the air between man and dog. The man sank to his knees, gripping the leash with trembling hands. His breath came fast, not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming swell of gratitude and awe. The dog turned his head, meeting his gaze, and for the first time the man saw no trace of the hollow silence that once filled those eyes. Instead, he saw strength, fire, and something even deeper, love. "You saved me," the man whispered, voice breaking. He pressed his forehead gently against the dog's, closing his eyes. "You saved me." Tears came then, unashamed, falling onto fur that smelled faintly of sun and dust. The dog didn't pull away. He stayed close, tail wagging once, steady and strong. The walk back felt different. The leash was still there, but the man no longer felt like the one leading. They moved together, side by side, a unit forged not in ease but in survival. Strangers glanced their way, but this time he didn't feel invisible, nor did he shrink from their eyes. He walked taller, chest lifted, matching the quiet pride of the creature beside him. When they returned home, the man collapsed onto the couch, the dog curling at his feet. Silence stretched again, but this silence was new, not heavy, not empty, but full. The weight of the world didn't feel as crushing now, because he wasn't carrying it alone. The man's mind drifted back to the alley, to the moment he almost walked away. If he had turned his back that night, this moment wouldn't exist. He would still be drowning in solitude, and the dog would be nothing more than a fading shadow. Instead, here they were, two souls bound by survival, standing stronger together than they ever could alone. He reached down, running his fingers through fur that had once been brittle and sparse but now glowed with health. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. And the man realized with a clarity that stole his breath, this wasn't rescue anymore. This was partnership. This was family. The days after the confrontation carried a different weight, softer yet fuller, as though the world itself had shifted around them. The man woke each morning to the sound of paws stretching against the floorboards, the gentle rhythm of a creature who no longer lived in fear of silence. The apartment, once hollow and muted, now carried the warmth of life, The steady thump of a tail, the rustle of movement, the low hum of comfort where once there had been nothing. The dog had grown strong. His fur shone under sunlight, his body filled out, his gait steady and assured. But the change wasn't just physical, it was in his eyes. Where there had once been shadow, now there was clarity, a brightness that carried trust without hesitation. Each glance toward the man no longer asked, "Will you hurt me?" but spoke instead of certainty, "You are mine and I am yours." The man felt it in himself too. His steps no longer dragged with the weight of loneliness. His laughter came more easily, his silence less suffocating. Evenings were no longer filled with the flicker of a muted television meant to drown out emptiness. Instead, there were walks at dusk, shared meals in quiet, and the presence of a heartbeat beside him that turned every moment into company. One morning, the man opened the window wide, letting sunlight flood the room. Dust motes spun in golden shafts, and the dog sprawled across the rug, eyes half closed, soaking in the warmth. The man watched him, coffee cup in hand, and realized how much his world had changed since that night in the alley. Rescue hadn't been a single act. It had been 1,000 tiny moments strung together. Feeding, bathing, whispering, waiting, trusting. Each one had stitched them tighter until they were inseparable. But the man knew there was one place left to return to. One place that still lingered in both their histories. The alley where they had first met. It was late afternoon when they went back, the sun low and orange, shadows stretching long across the streets. The alley hadn't changed much. The same cracked pavement, the same smell of rust and rain clinging to brick. A dented trash can leaned against the wall, graffiti scrawled across faded bricks. Yet walking into it now felt like stepping into another life entirely. The dog paused at the mouth of the alley, nose twitching. His body tensed for a moment, memory flickering in the air. The man crouched beside him, hand resting gently on his back. "It's okay," he whispered. "That was then. Look at you now." They stepped forward together. The man stopped where he remembered first seeing him. Curled against the wall, ribs sharp against skin. Eyes clouded and dim. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash through him, then looked at the dog standing tall beside him. Strong, whole, alive. The dog turned, pressing his head lightly against the man's thigh, tail swishing in slow, steady rhythm. It was as if he, too, understood the full circle of it. The man's throat tightened. He crouched down, cupping the dog's face in his hands, feeling the warmth of life beneath his palms. His eyes stung, but his voice was steady. "We made it, buddy. We're not going back. Not ever." The sun slipped lower, bathing the alley in golden light, and for a moment it felt like the city itself bore witness. What had once been a place of despair now stood as a monument to survival, to connection, to love carved from brokenness. They left the alley slowly, side by side, their shadows stretching long ahead of them. That night, back in the apartment, the man lay on the couch with the dog curled beside him, head resting against his chest. The room was quiet but no longer empty. He traced lazy circles into fur, listening to the steady beat of the heart beneath. The man's thoughts drifted, not with sorrow, not with fear, but with gratitude. He thought about how close he had come to walking away, how easily this story could have been lost. And he thought about the way a single moment of choosing compassion had rewritten not only the dog's life, but his own. He whispered into the darkness, words soft but certain. "You saved me as much as I saved you." The dog stirred, sighing deeply, then settled again. The man smiled, eyes closing, his own breath evening out. And in that silence, rich, warm, filled with presence, two souls, once broken and alone, found home in each other. The city outside buzzed with its endless noise, but inside the apartment, peace reigned. The man drifted to sleep with a final thought etched into him like scripture. Some rescues are not about saving a life. They are about sharing one. The night had grown still, the city humming softly beyond the apartment walls. The man lay on the couch. The dog curled against him, their breaths slowly falling into rhythm. He stared at the ceiling, one hand resting lightly on the rise and fall of the chest beneath it. Once, he had thought he was saving a stray. Now, he understood the truth. Some rescues are not one-sided. They are exchanges, soul for soul, brokenness for belonging. The alley had given him a companion, but it had also given him back to himself, Outside, the world would keep rushing. Sirens, footsteps, laughter, rain. But here, in the quiet of a room that was no longer empty, two beings who had once been starving, one for food, the other for meaning, had found exactly what they needed. The man closed his eyes, whispering into the silence, "We're home now." The dog stirred, pressed closer, and with that small gesture, sealed the truth neither of them would ever forget. They had saved each other.